guys, welcome back to My Steps to Sobriety, my show on YouTube and as a podcast with me, your host, Freda Narev. Today is another day for an interview, and it is a beautiful day. And it is one of these days which I've been actually looking forward to for weeks now, because I've got Bob Narev with me. Bob is a fellow New Zealander, but his story starts in a country far, far away, at a time very distant to us. And we will be talking about some very painful things. But instead of taking all the powder away from him, first of all, let me say hello. Good morning to you, Bob. Thank you so much for being on my show.
Good morning to you.
But you were not really born as Bob Narev. What was your real name when you first saw the light of this beautiful earth?
My first name was Robert Narewkiewicz, which is a Polish origin, but I was born in Germany in 1935. And when we came to New Zealand, the long name became unpronounceable, so we cut it in half, and I'm now Bob Narev.
And it's beautiful, and that is the story of so many people around the world, because the Second World War and the Nazi regime led to so many changes and so much movement of people around the world for all kind of reasons that this is actually a very common thing, especially out here in beautiful New Zealand. We are a bit of a melting pot of different people over the years, so it's beautiful. Bob Narev. What can you remember from your childhood?
My memory of my early days is fairly limited. And I think basically that I'm told is due to the fact that young children who live through traumatic events tend to put aside and almost forget the events which were painful. Having said that, I still remember enough to be able to talk about my early life.
For those of you who are not so good in history, 1935 was just 2 years after the Third Reich came into the being. In other words, Adolf Hitler had taken control of the helm in 1933, and pretty much within a short time frame had changed Germany from a state of utter chaos, from unemployment that was through the roof, towards a state that was essentially glorified around the world. People were looking over and said, wow, the man of the year. And you know, this was a country to be reckoned with. Germany, great. What people didn't really pay so much attention to is the 2,200 laws that were put into place to make Jewish life hell. And that is exactly where you were born into.
Yes, well, I was born 3 weeks after the passing of the Nuremberg laws, which of course were the discriminatory ones against the Jewish population, initially in Germany and ultimately in the whole of conquered Europe.
And of course, whenever you do a project, you start off with something and then you refine things. The Nazis were doing the same. They brought out the Nuremberg laws and then thought, actually, we can squeeze a bit there and be a bit mean there, etc. So it was actually getting worse and worse and worse. But as a young child, you typically don't remember your first 2-3 years at all. But then it's an amazing what you said, because you pointed so much to the fact that many concentration camp survivors actually highlight that their earliest memories are often not there. There's very little there. A lot of repression occurring. What was the first thing that you remember? What were sort of the first glimpses where you look either back with a smile or with other feelings?
Well, I don't remember the first 2 or 3 years of my life, other than the fact that having been born in 1935, we had to shift from the town where I was born, Eschwege, to Frankfurt. because my father had lost his job at the local secondary school, being no longer required as a Jew to teach non-Jewish children. And we finished up in Frankfurt, and we were then living with two elderly grandmothers. My grandfathers had died years before, and I do remember having to shift from the house that we were in to a particular part of town, which effectively became a ghetto, a concentration area where the Jews had to live, and generally were not allowed to mix with the general populace. And I do remember that. It was until 1942, until I was 6 years old. Of course, I didn't yet go to school because in Germany at the time, schooling started at the age of 6. So all I remember is that, first of all, we had to wear the Judenstern, the Jewish star, by way of identification, and there were severe penalties, if not worse, if you were found in the street without it. And we often had to get off the footpath to make way for, shall we say, real Germans, as they were called. And I became conscious of the fact that somehow we were different from the normal population.
That, of course, is very hard for a 6-year-old to get your head around that. More so, your father was a teacher. He was a very recognized man, and a man who would have had his principles, and he would have had his kindness, also his authoritative ways. That's what a teacher was in the 1930s. Yet here he suddenly lost his job. He was lucky, though. He found another position in a Jewish school in Frankfurt, wasn't it?
That's right. And that continued until early 1942, when the Nazis closed that school because they considered that it was no longer necessary to teach Jewish children because their future was likely to be bleak.
Did your father know that? Did you have an inkling that that bleakness was reality? Did someone prime you? What were the attempts of your parents to either convey that message or hide that message from you?
Well, it was the latter. They hid the message from me. We never, as a family, talked about what was happening. I would be surprised if my parents didn't know what was happening and where we might finish up. But my one regret is that I didn't talk enough to my mother in later years to get her knowledge of what was happening. And by the time we became seriously conscious of the past, she had also gone, although she came with me to New Zealand after the Holocaust.
But that's the curse of a young generation, of every single generation. I only really the last 10 years became more serious in my own historical kind of roots. And by now, everything is too late. I could have asked all these questions many, many years before. No one ever does when they're 21, full of testosterone and bulletproof.
Yeah, and the personal information is irretrievable.
Is it not?
We've learned a lot about the past, about the Holocaust, but nothing useful from the point of view of the Narev family, other than the experiences of which I do remember, of course.
Mm-hmm. Now, your story is actually quite unique because you, by fate, by the stroke of luck, ended up in very unusual circumstances. First of all, you ended up in a concentration camp, but this concentration camp was a very different one compared with many of the others. This one was actually a Potemkin village, if you want to say so. It was a pretend place. It was Theresienstadt. What can you remember of Theresienstadt?
Well, first of all, Theresienstadt, or Terezin as it's called in Czech, was basically a transit camp. Jews were being assembled from all parts of Europe, ultimately to be transported to Auschwitz and similar murder camps, if we can call them that. But having said that, over 30,000 of the Jews who were taken there died in that camp, basically malnutrition, disease, and so forth. And of the 140 odd thousand who passed through, I think only 17,000 survived, and a minimal number of children.
Indeed. And these figures are unimaginable. And yet this was the reality for so many out there. The question therefore arises, how can you be here? How, why, what forces of this universe protected you? What changed in your case? What made you different?
Well, I'm sorry, I don't know whether there were any forces involved. I'm not a particularly religious person, but I'm a traditional Jew. But I don't know where the control lay. The only two matters which I think might have had some influence, and that is, first of all, that my father did fight for Germany in the First World War and got an Iron Cross, albeit second class. And my mother was ultimately employed in the camp as a slave laborer to assist in the German war effort by working in a munitions factory. And those two factors may have contributed to the fact that we were left in Terezin rather than being taken away. So that was the first stroke of good luck, if we can call it that.
May I interrupt though?
Yes.
How many Jews have fought for Germany in the First World War? That's a rhetorical question. It is a statement. Many Jews finally saw the First World War and saw their nationality as a beautiful thing. They actually became soldiers because they thought, yes, as Jews we can show that we are part of Germany, we are proud of it, and therefore there was this hope in the First World War amongst many Jews to actually, wow, we are finally, this anti-Semitism is a thing of the past. We can show that we are a valuable member of society. So this is a story again and again that comes out in history. Yet those same men have not made it through. Those same men ended up in the same gas chambers or in front of the same bullets as many other Jews who had not fought in the First World War. So whilst it is a beautiful thing to somehow think that someone actually maybe looked at the individual histories, I have difficulties accepting that, knowing that this was basically mass murder on an industrial scale. The individuals, unless you maybe knew them, this would have been very, very unlikely that would have made a big influence.
Yeah, it was not only on an industrial scale in terms of numbers, but the equipment that was used to exterminate 6 million people in gas chambers or by some other industrial method.
Indeed, right. And it's absolute madness to even imagine that nowadays. And it's 6 million. How many Jews at that time were actually? What do you know the overall figures? How many people identified as Jewish around that time of 1933, let's say?
I have no idea. The Germans had accurate records, of course. That's how they were able to identify us, because there was a method of registration of religion in Germany at the time. But what the numbers were, I have no idea.
Regrettably, a huge amount, because if you then look later on, if you talk to people out there who are Jewish and talk about them in the 50s and 60s, if you listen to interviews, then you realize that out of their families, they would have been typically larger families, yet there would have been 80-90% would no longer be there. So that was the impact that the Shoah had on Jewish families. It ripped them apart to a degree that is unimaginable for us. This was not one murder. This was not one death of starvation. And it's crazy. But we need to highlight that.
Yeah, well, this is it. And for example, I have never known, and of course never can know, my father-in-law, my mother-in-law, my sister-in-law, my uncle, and so the list grows of people who simply disappeared at a time when I was too young to understand what was happening.
So the world knew. We need to accept that. The Germans knew. There's often in the 70s, 80s, when I started to go to school, I was born 66, so I started school 1972, and we had from the word go history as part of our education, and that was mandatory. You couldn't somehow opt out of it. That was actually a very good thing. And we talked in depth about everything, Holocaust, etc. So I must say that my school education as a young German in the 70s, 80s was actually superb. And I say that with a little bit of pride, knowing how that has changed nowadays in schools, how little the Holocaust is actually being talked about, and how little understanding young people nowadays get.
So I've had one experience that emphasizes that. We'll come later on to the fact that we've talked a lot to schools here about our experiences. And on a visit to Germany, to the town where I was born, and indeed invited to the school where my father had been a teacher, we told our stories. And at the end, during Q&A, one of the boys asked how we felt about them. And of course, the answer was simple. We will never forget, but we have nothing against the current generation because they weren't even alive. But on the other hand, given what you've just said about the education that you received, when we spoke to a school here in New Zealand, where there was a German exchange student, about 16 or 17 years old, the first he'd heard of the Holocaust was our talk.
You're kidding me.
Yes.
Oh, bollocks. So in other words, obviously I look at it with rose-tinted glasses because of the education that I had received. Obviously things have changed there as well for the worse, which maybe then explains one of the things that I wanted to come about later to. Why the hell do we see again a rise of anti-Semitism in Europe? And maybe now that is less of a strange question to me, but rather you have given me already half an answer there. Bloody hell.
Well, sorry, but I don't know how general that position is in schools, but certainly this one was a prime example of not knowing.
Yeah, that is, sorry, when I was at school, you could not know about the Holocaust. There was no way. There was no way. Okay, we talked in extent about everything that led up to it. We saw we saw a version that was taught in schools about things that had happened. Full stop. When I say a version, it is the history is always written by the victor, isn't it? So there is we had the pendulum swinging when I was at school. All Germans are bad. There's this collective guilt. You're a nasty piece of work because of what happened in the Holocaust. Around about that time, actually, the pendulum started swinging back, and young teenagers like me, we actually said, well, hang on, this was what, 40 years ago or something like that? I'm not guilty. And that sort of swung back the other way to actually say, well, hang on, stop ramming that down my throat. It can't have been so bad. And then, of course,
can we compare that to the idea of original sin? That is it passed on to us, what has been done by our ancestors?
I see where you're coming from. Very true. Very true. And Oh, but it's weird because then, if I follow that path, so the pendulum swung back. So you now had all of the Holocaust deniers of the 70s, 80s, 90s who made their living in saying, no, it was not so bad, fudging the figures a bit. What do you mean 6 million? Maybe 30,000, maybe 300,000. And these were so-called historians who were going out there. You in New Zealand, did you hear anything about that? About this kind of Holocaust denying that sort of came around about the 90s?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And this is one of the reasons why we speak to schools, and possibly why I'm speaking to you now, because we feel that our ability to tell the real story from our point of view will be some counter to the Holocaust deniers. Now, I can't, from anything that I know, prove that 6 million Jews were killed, but I can refer people to volume after volume at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, where the Germans' own records have the names and date of extermination of so many people, including my uncle, my aunt, and my cousin that I referred to earlier.
Mm. And that is so beautiful because that Yad Vashem must be the resource in the world for the Holocaust, the Shoah. It is also a beautiful, beautiful learning experience. Yad Vashem, for those of you out there who are interested, go there to the website. They run courses. I did an online course on anti-Semitism, which was absolutely superb. And it taught me a lot of it gave me a lot of understanding. And it is beautiful. They from now and then do virtual tours for the Yad Vashem Museum. And it just gives me goosebumps, actually. I took part in such a virtual tour, and it is a wonderful, wonderful place, which uses a wonderful way of teaching you. Because 6 million, what's 6 million? I don't know what 6 million is. I've never seen 6 million of anything. So, but when they show you a face smiling into a camera and give you a name, then that means something.
Yes, I have been with my wife to Israel several times and Yad Vashem, and the only thing that we couldn't stay with was a room devoted to the children who were murdered. And that room contains one candle and a whole series of mirrors, and that gives you an idea of numbers. And there's a continuous reading of names of children who didn't make it. And that was so traumatic for us that we just couldn't stay. But otherwise, we know what happened. And quite frankly, we would like to know as much as possible about it to assist us with the story that we tell and the memories which we haven't got.
So true. So true. And that is exactly what you do here, because we are sharing your story on my podcast. And hopefully with that we ignite the flame somewhere for someone to actually get curious, to see, maybe deal with their own ancestry, because there is more ancestry becomes accessible to us with the help of DNA kits, DNA tests that you can do, ancestry.com, MyHeritage. There's a whole bunch of things out there where suddenly you can actually find living relatives that you never knew you had, your third, fourth cousin somewhere who is around this world. So it's actually beautiful. But with that, you can actually travel back in time. And you can actually
ancestry is an interesting concept because we registered for it, and it turned out that I was 100% Ashkenazi Jewish, whereas my wife, who was born in Poland, was only 87% Jewish, and we still feel that there might have been somewhere down the line some Cossacks involved in the family.
Which is normal, isn't it? It is wherever the love falls, it is. And that's the interesting thing. And that's the interesting thing nowadays, because there is a pitfall in that as well. When you suddenly have DNA tests and you can actually say, hang on, you are actually 25% Jew, 87% Jew, I'm 1% Jew. So what does that mean? Does that mean I'm Jewish? Does that mean maybe a new government now has got access to all kind of biometrical data to say, great, super, these Jews, see, they're at it again. The world Jewry is again trying to get us all down. Let's find them with the help of DNA testing, much more reliable than the facial measurements that crazy scientists in the 30s tried to put out there as the measure. See, you're brown-eyed, your nose is typical nose. So, well, I would have been toast. Yet,
that's the 1%, you see.
Yeah, oh, that's the one. No, my nose is actually bigger than 1% of my body. Come on, give me a bit more credit here. But no, it's that madness. It's that craziness. And we need to point that out as such a crap, as such a nut-full thing.
Yes, you were talking about the pitfalls of ancestry with the records that this provides to whoever has a nefarious intent. They can readily identify. And of course, the Germans had ways of identifying who was Jewish. And they started basically by wanting to blame someone for what had happened after the First World War. And the easiest group to blame were the Jews. And my mother used to say they blamed Jews and cyclists. Why? And the question then was, why cyclists? And the answer was, why Jews?
I love it. I love it. And that's so true, isn't it?
It's so true.
That's, if you look at anti-Semitism and after the reasons that were somehow put forward by anti-Semites, why Jews were actually the nasty people that they were supposed to be, you just think, what? But then again, you have to go back to the times. You have to go back to the places where anti-Semitism and the love for Hitler became so prevalent. You had basically, after the Treaty of Versailles, you had, as I said, unemployment in some parts like Tyrolia, in the border between Austria and Italy. 74% of unemployment. Young people had no chance whatsoever. And guess what? If you're a young man who is used to climbing up mountains, fit ass, well, the SS looks actually very tempting. Okay? So we need to actually think about, why do people want to join crazy movements? Because what they have got is very, very poor. They have no hope. They feel helpless. They feel disempowered, etc. So if you're in such a scenario, then it's very easy to fall into the trap of, oh, look, the grass is always greener, or in this case, it's beautiful to have an enemy, and this enemy is Jews, regardless if that actually makes any sense or not. But it is very tempting to fall prey to such things, and we see that now. East Germany, where there is still an inequality with regards to the haves and have-nots, while there's still a huge disconnect between the strata of society. Well, guess what? The AfD, the modern right-wing idiots, they are huge. They're 25% or so thereabouts.
Yeah, but of course, we've got to remember also that historically, anti-Semitism goes back for more than 2,000 years.
Correct. And many people don't recognize that the pogroms were in the medieval ages, and especially sort of in Russia, more the Eastern Bloc. They have been are notoriously bad, but not just Eastern Bloc. You talk medieval France, you talk medieval other countries. That is, Jews were always out there. I mean, why? Why do you think that is? I mean, we might as well teach people a bit why social historically that actually occurred.
Well, the only way I can answer that is to say that if you're looking for somebody to blame for something, either for not following your own religion or some other economic or social problem, you look for somebody to blame, and the easier the identification, the easier it is to blame that group.
True.
Whether that is a proper analysis or not, I leave to others to decide.
True. And of course, there is the self-fulfilling prophecy, because many times Jews were not allowed to do certain jobs within society and had to fall back onto jobs that were deemed not so glorious. For example, the money lending, for example, those kind of issue banking, the early forms of it. And ultimately, the Jews, due to their connections, due to their networking, due to their modern things that we accept as very good business practices, were therefore actually very successful. Jews are hard workers, or were hard workers, but they also, of course, showed their beliefs, showed their religion, their faith in the way they dressed, in the way they communicated, in the way they behaved. Yeah, so it was becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah, yet it's still crazy. It's still crazy for me. I cannot understand it, and I don't think I ever will. Even on my deathbed, I will still not understand how you can be so naive to think that actually thinking about one group in society, that they could all be if you just get rid of them, that somehow all the problems disappear. How stupid can you be?
One of the points, of course, is this, that through the centuries, Jews were expelled from some countries and had to restart in other countries, as we did here. And for that reason, perhaps we've had to try harder to re-establish ourselves, may have done in many cases fairly well, and therefore created jealousy.
And that is actually not necessarily try again. Too many necessaries in that sentence. That might not necessarily have anything to do with Jews, because I have left my country, and because of a number of reasons. The moment you do it once, that sets you apart from others who are just sitting there and are just accepting their fate as it is. So the 5% that are leaving a country are typically the go-getters, are those people who are actually willing to put the work in, regardless now of religious background, etc. So there might be two things happening here at the same time.
Yeah, the only difference is, and I don't know anything about your circumstances, but I would say that probably you left because you wanted to, not because you were thrown out.
Touché. And we need to come back to that. You're quite right. But I'm trying to say, okay, you can never just put a finger on one spot. Now we've figured out why something happened. It's always multifactorial. Why did Jews not try to escape and flee in greater numbers? I asked another Holocaust survivor about exactly that point, and she was pointing out that her parents were young. They had just built up their family. They had just built up their business. They were working hard every hour of the day to make it to something, and they didn't want to leave that, despite the fact that the writing was on the wall. So that's what I mean. There are always other factors there. You cannot easily point to one and say, hey, that's it. No, but you're so right. You're so right, Bob.
But that was really the position with us to some extent, in that my parents didn't believe that it was going to get as bad as it did. And when it got so bad, they applied for a visa to go, of all places, to Uruguay. And that visa came through the day war broke out. And of course, we couldn't go. Otherwise, I'd be speaking Spanish to another interviewer.
Oh, dear. That was, yeah. Bob, I want to come back to Theresienstadt because I want to talk about the lie that was portrayed. So, whilst I am quite outspoken to say actually everyone should have known and to a certain degree did know about the Holocaust, there were quite great attempts made to conceal the fate of Jews. Tell us a bit about the filming that happened at Theresienstadt.
Well, I knew nothing of the filming at Theresienstadt until many years later.
Right.
I wasn't involved in the group that was filmed. It was only a small group that was selected to appear before the Red Cross delegates in a part of Theresienstadt that was dollied up for the purpose. And it was used purely as a propaganda effort to show that life was normal there. But they didn't say that very soon after the group had left Theresienstadt, virtually all the people who were involved in that film were shipped off to Auschwitz.
So it was not a protection for them.
No.
It was not, no. The crazy thing then is you were essentially destined for the same fate. Yet, somehow, some wheelings and dealings happened behind the scenes, and you actually ended up in Switzerland. With
that was the second bit of good fortune, in that in February 1945, 3 months before the war finished, the Germans called for 1,200 volunteers to go to Switzerland. Nobody believed that that was going to be the destination, but I was by then 9 years old. I wanted to go on another train trip. I nagged my mother to volunteer. By then, both my grandmothers and my father had died in the camp. The two old ladies because they just couldn't cope, and my father because he didn't survive an operation. And in the end, my mother succumbed to the what should we call it, the machinations of her young son, and volunteered. And we were among the 1,200 who were able to leave. It was in itself fortunate because after we had left, the transmission of people to Auschwitz had actually stopped. But there was a major episode of typhoid fever in the camp, and many people died as a result of that and lack of medication. So we might well not have survived had we not been on that train to Switzerland.
And let's be just quite clear here in your book. You, by the way, yes. Sorry, I meant to show that. You wrote a beautiful book where you actually summarized your fate and the story, and it is a beautiful book. And I've been honored. Thank you so much for sending me a copy. It is wonderful. And in there, I note that you wrote that you're not really sure why this suddenly the Nazis sent 1,200 people to Switzerland. And
having said that in the book, I've subsequently found out what actually happened. Too late to include it in the book. But what happened, in fact, and I have it on reasonably good authority, is that a group of Orthodox Jews in New York gathered $1 million American and offered that money to Himmler, one of the highest officials in the Nazi party, if he would let 1,200 people go. And that was arranged through an intermediary in Switzerland who knew Himmler very, very well.
Correct.
And that's how it came to pass.
Correct.
And whether Himmler was ever able to use any of the money, I don't know, because, of course, he was tried at the end of the war as a war criminal. And I'm not sure whether he was executed or committed suicide, but he didn't get the benefit of the money. And the other thing is that apparently Hitler found out fairly soon after our event what had happened and prohibited any further activity of that kind.
And I think that is in its own right a whole story in itself, because what you were part of was history there. Many of the top leaders of the Nazi Reich knew that the writing was on the wall with regards to their future. So they knew the war was lost. And from 1944 onwards, people tried to find ways how to get out. And they started developing the red lines that later, in the next 2 years after the Second World War, allowed so many Nazis to escape to South America via Italy, via the Vatican, and via other ways and sources. But many of the big guys up there actually did wheelings and dealings, and you pointed the one out to Himmler. So therefore it's good that you found out, because I was aware of those kind of movements behind the scenes. So I would have added that piece of information had you not taken it already, given it already away.
Yeah.
So you're so right. So and unfortunately, so many other people managed to escape. So many other Nazis did not meet a court or a well-deserved bullet, for that matter. You guys ended up suddenly from Theresienstadt, from poverty, from absolute craziness, from people dying in front of you, from death. I mean, the stink of Theresienstadt would have been just, you couldn't come close to the camp for kilometers without actually smelling it. From there, bang, you're in Switzerland. How the hell? I mean, what a transition! Can you remember that?
I can remember it, but as a 9-year-old,
yeah,
it almost seemed normal. Strange as it may sound,
yeah,
that we went from A to B, and obviously completely different conditions and circumstances and treatment, which was very good by the Swiss. But I didn't require much adjustment. My mother, who was the only other survivor, couldn't look after me because she had nothing with which to do so. So I finished up in an orphanage in Switzerland, and I was accepted there, and life was good, other than the fact that I only had a mother left.
But there's luckily the resilience of us, of the youngsters who are just want to play ball and want to throw a snowball and want to do whatever it is that takes their fancy.
And my mother certainly did not have that resilience. And in fact, she had nightmares for the rest of her life about experiences and the closeness of death, had it not been for circumstances.
How did your story continue? How long did you stay in Switzerland?
2.5 years. And my mother's sister and her family had come to New Zealand just before the war, found out that we had survived, and with some difficulty, because the government wasn't too keen at that time to take Jewish refugees, got permission for us to come. So we arrived here in November 1947. And as we always say now, we reached paradise.
Was there any Zionism in your mum's belief? Was she tempted at any stage to not go New Zealand but rather go to Israel?
Well, all this happened, of course, before the state was founded. So I don't think the thought occurred to her.
Good.
Particularly because she had family here, and that was the logical place to go, quite apart from the fact that it was the furthest place you could go from Germany, and because if you went any further, you were on the way back.
Correct. I can feel her. I can feel that sentiment. And then you jumped on the ship, and suddenly your life changed, and you were in New Zealand, which would have been a very different place than it is now when you arrived.
Different, but nevertheless, as much for us, as much paradise as it has been from the start. My mother had a little school English, so she managed. She was trained as an opera teacher, but finished up as her first job here uh, as a person working in a factory putting squiggles on chocolates. And I started from zero as far as English is concerned, and I'm gradually learning it.
But here you are. You are a man who has been keen to embrace his life, and over the next few years and decades, you left your own imprint on Auckland, and you just loved to live. Tell us a bit about that. I mean, there's so many accolades and so many things that you have achieved here
Yes.
throughout the years. Give us a few a sneak preview.
Yeah,
That would be a whole law society interview in its own right.
Well, the only question at this point is, at what stage do I bring my wife into this?
Oh yeah. Well, where did you meet her? Because that would have been,
not into the room, but for me to tell the background there, because that's quite important. She was born in Poland, in a little town which is now part of Belarus, where her parents, like mine in Germany, had been living for literally decades as apparently normal members of the community until the Nazis arrived there in 1941. Her father was in the first 15 men who were shot when the Nazis arrived because they wanted to get rid of the leaders of the community. Frida's mother realized that Frida, then 3 years old, was unlikely to survive, took her to a Catholic friend on a farm nearby, left her there, and disappeared with one of the other two sisters. And Frida was on the farm with the lady, who was very kind, gracious, and helpful, looked after her until late 1944, when the only other surviving member of her family, and a sister 11 years older, who had joined the partisans in the woods nearby, survived and came to pick up Frida. The lady was reluctant to let Frida go because she'd taken the risk for herself and her teenage son in hiding her, but in the end agreed. And the two sisters and the sister's husband, because he'd been married by then, finished up in various displaced persons camps in Germany, including the town where I was born, incidentally. But of course, I'd left by then. And we're all ready to go to Israel to start a new life there. But fortunately for me, and there's another eventful episode, just before they were due to leave with the group, Frida caught an ear infection, wasn't able to travel with the group. And in the meantime, members of her family who'd come to New Zealand before the war found out that they had survived and got them a permit to come to New Zealand. And there I met her in a Jewish youth group. And when I saw her, I said, that's the girl for me. And now, next month, 63 years ago, she became my girl. And we have 3 children and 8 grandchildren, all of whom are in Australia. So we haven't seen them for a year. And that's the background, which I think is important in the context of where we go from here.
Oh, please. Absolutely. No, it is the passion with which trauma survivors embrace life once they can, and it's that joy of living and that willingness to go out there, and if the opportunity doesn't arise, you make the opportunity. I think that is something that is very clear in your history, and you're quite right. It's beautiful. I would have come to Frida there because obviously you want to meet someone. You're a young man out there, and these hormones, they are there. They want to say hello to you too.
Well, we made a fairly early decision as a couple, look forward rather than back, and I think that has helped both of us to get through the memories and to start a life which has proved to be comfortable and safe, despite COVID and possibly other factors, which we'll come to as the interview goes on.
You're quite right. You're quite right. So here you are. You're living your life. You're a young couple. You are building your own life and legacy. And of course you're tempted to look forward, not backward. But sooner or later in many stories, something happens that made you stop and made you look backwards. What was that in your case?
Well, looking backwards to the extent of A, wanting to know for ourselves, and B, being able to impart that background to others. We have been speaking to schools and adult groups for a number of years now. In fact, I've recently finished talk number 107. So you can see we've been fairly busy. Not in 1 month. It goes back probably 10 years. And we've done it because we felt it was necessary not only to tell young people what had happened to us in the hope that they learn from that and help prevent it happening again, but also for them to be able to tell their parents and friends who weren't at the talk what they'd heard from us.
But what made you change your tack? Because here you were living your own life, actually not running away, that's a negative term, but focusing on the future, as you have put it. What made you stop? Why did you suddenly want to know about the past? Why did you suddenly become the man you are now, who is going out there to teach?
Well, in the organizations with which I've been involved, there's been progressively more interest and study of the past that we're talking about. For example, among my many sins, I happen to be chairman of an organization which was called the Holocaust Foundation, and it's now changed its name to the Holocaust and Anti-Semitism Foundation, which will give you some idea of the reason why we changed. And we realized that it is not only a matter of looking forward, but a necessity to look back. Not so much for ourselves, but firstly for our children and grandchildren, but more important because they already know a fair bit of what happened to us, for those who perhaps have no idea what went on at the time.
And you're going out there and you're working on the grassroots level and basically influence young whippersnappers at a time when they're still malleable, which is so beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. If I could put you together now with the Minister for Education and put you into a room, what would you tell that person? What would you tell the Ministry of Education with regards to the need to address that on a more formal level?
Well, I can say this, that another organization with which I have a peripheral connection called the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand, which is run from Wellington, capital city, who have started a scheme whereby firstly they send teachers to Israel and in particular to Yad Vashem to enable them to know more in order to teach it. And they've also initiated, and it's now been accepted officially, a scheme whereby it becomes part of the curriculum of secondary schools. A certain amount of time, not a great deal, but a certain amount of time spent in schools studying that particular topic.
Oh,
so it is happening.
Good. And high time, because we need that as a starting point and then take it from there, because at the moment you start about talking the Shoah, it inevitably starts opening a young mind's vision up, and they can actually see other examples around the world where things are not the way they really want them to be, or they would love to live in.
Yeah, I don't need to tell the Minister of Education, the one that you suggest I should talk to, that they should do something. But I could tell him to do more, to concentrate on it, to keep the idea of the current scheme going as far as possible. Also in relation to anti-Semitism, of course, not just the Holocaust. The two, to a certain extent, run together.
How can we continue? Because time is against us. I hate the thought, but one day I will die, and like it or lump it. Hopefully that is 50 years from now, but maybe I'm not so lucky. But I want to leave a legacy, and I know you do too. How can we continue after our deaths to put the importance of this topic out there? I mean, unfortunately, there are not many survivors of concentration camps around now. This is an ever-dwindling number. How can we make sure that these voices remain heard?
Well, we can't make sure, obviously, but we can try to emphasize the need for continuing education, both in the school area and for adults as well. But, you've got to ask yourself how many people now, particularly in New Zealand, know about the pogroms in Eastern Europe at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. How many people know about the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion from Spain? Any century contains some problem which tends to be forgotten. And there's no guarantee that this will not be forgotten, but all we can do is emphasize the need, not only from the point of, I don't want to generalize by saying the Holocaust is just another event of persecution and discrimination and indeed genocide, but it is so unique, as you put it, as an industrial scheme to get rid of a whole part of the population, that you can't compare it to anything else that's going on now. But having said that, educate in one sense, and hopefully it will also reflect in another.
If you were able to send a message in a bottle back to your younger self, if you were able to send a message in a time capsule back to the young teenager in you, what would it be?
Well, first of all, I don't know whether the bottle will be discovered. And secondly, going back a long way, I would endeavor to persuade my parents to apply for the Uruguay visa earlier than they did. But the real message would be, to tell as much as one can in a bottle what did happen and what hopefully will be learned from it in order to at least attempt to prevent it recurring.
Amen. And that is exactly what we are doing here. That is exactly which I will continue to do, to speak out for those people who cannot speak out anymore, or indeed for those who are suffering in silence. And that suffering is unfortunately ongoing. Trauma is out there for everyone, and especially 2021, 2022 coming, 2020. These were very upsetting years due to COVID and for a whole number of other reasons. A lot of nasty things are happening, but that does not excuse us for not paying attention to the past and trying to prevent that those things do not happen. And that's our duty. That's our duty as parents, as educators, teachers, influencers, whatever role you have in your life out there. You have a voice, and you can choose what comes out of your mouth, and you can choose what you want to think about and what you want to change. You can't change the world. You can't eye that up, one click and change climate change. No. But you can make small decisions. You can have small conversations.
But there's a better understanding also in official circles. If I can give you one or two examples. The first one is that on a Holocaust memorial function, it was attended by the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. On another function, it was attended by the lady who was the then Governor General of New Zealand. And I'm happy to say that she is the only Governor General who has ever kissed me. so,
is there more to that story?
Yeah,
Shall we just get Frida out of the room?
No, Frida was there and knows. But it's an indication of the sympathy which is being generated. But of course, there's the other side of the story, which we don't need to go into at this point. And also, you might have seen in the book that for the community work which I've been doing, and I don't want to blow my own trumpet, I became a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit. And when they found out that I'd already given over 100 talks to schools, they increased that to an officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit. And the second one was given not only for community service, but for education. And the only education I've ever done is the talks to schools and other groups. So there is a recognition. How that will continue in the longer term is hard to tell. But in case I don't get a chance a little later in this interview, and not wanting a situation where we pat each other on the back, I do want to say how much I appreciate your interest, your concern in this topic, and how great it is that this is being promulgated by somebody who's obviously got standing in the community and who can transmit a message which otherwise might not be as strong.
And hopefully also through a channel that people don't really expect. Let's put it like that. I'm talking about trauma, and I come towards trauma from an alcoholic point of view. Now, I've got heaps of trauma in my past. There is PTSD, anxiety, depression, all those kind of things. But they're caused by trauma. They're caused by things that had occurred to me. And by actually talking about those kind of things openly, I try to demystify addiction, demystify mental health problems, etc. Now, it is only logical for me to therefore also address intergenerational trauma, the trauma that happened to the generations before me, and what bigger trauma could there be than the Shoah, the Holocaust. So therefore, for me, that is a logical thing. But hopefully, by actually people listening to my show, we can touch people who would have otherwise not addressed the topic at all. And therefore, I think that is a beautiful roundabout way to spread the word and encourage people to talk about things that are not so nice and learn.
It will be interesting to see what sort of commentary you get from people who will see the podcast. I was interviewed in a similar way by a member of Parliament, Simon O'Connor, our local MP. And of the comments that he got, I don't think there was one that was negative. But it'll be interesting to see and to hear from you what sort of comments you receive as a result of this interview.
No, that's beautiful. Bob, you're a great man. You are a wonderful man for going out there and trying to shape or reshape consciousness and trying to refocus attention onto the Holocaust and onto the lessons that we can learn from it. Those lessons that are otherwise forgotten. What would be one of the key things you would say to a young teenager nowadays? My teenagers, I've got a 19 and 21-year-old, they are interested in gaming, they're interested in, they don't know about their future, they're a little bit Larry-fairy up there. What would you tell a young person like that?
Well, I already have 6 of our 8 grandchildren who are either teenagers or in their early 20s, so I'm pretty close to that area. What I would tell them is precisely what we've been talking about. In other words, A, the need to remember and not forget, and B, to use every possible opportunity to pass on to others, Jewish or not Jewish, who may not know what in fact occurred and what the consequences are, in the hope that the message will spread. And I don't know that I can tell you anything else that I would say to them. Be good people.
Isn't it? And that's exactly right. And that's what I try to be. Integrity, humility, servitude. These are beautiful things, and when you actually put them into your life and truly live by them, life enriches in a way that you can't even ever imagine, because so many new opportunities arise from each good deed that you do. And inevitably, and it is, I don't know if it's fate, karma, whatever you want to call it, but it's a beautiful life. And I so encourage everyone out there to do that. And Bob, I'm incredibly grateful that you shared your wisdom and your story and the story of Frida out there, because these are voices that are so important to be heard. I'm honored and I'm humbled that you came onto my show. So thank
And
you so much.
I'm grateful to you for allowing me to talk to you.
No trouble at all. Well, Bob, I'm wishing you and Frida and your whole family a Merry Christmas and a happy, healthy, wealthy 2022. And the same actually is for everyone else out there. Guys, I believe in you. Stay strong. Look after yourself. And by doing so, you become those people that other people look up to. So there's a snowball system going here, snowball turning into a big avalanche. How, could we maybe make this world a little bit better? Well, I believe so. That's the reason that I'm sitting here with Bob and listen to those important messages and try to spread them out there. So guys, now it's up to you. Go out there, spread the message of be a good man, be a good human being, and go out there and look after yourself.
And my message to you is continue doing what you're doing.
Thank you so much. Bye.
All the best. Bye.